I've lived long enough to know that family can be your greatest blessing or your deepest wound. The day my daughter Caroline looked me in the eyes and said I would be moving to the servants' quarters above their garage, I felt my heart crack like fine china dropped on marble floors. What she didn't realize was that the magnificent colonial estate she called home, along with all 42 properties in Fairfield Estates, the exclusive country club, and even the private lake where my grandchildren sailed their summer afternoons away, all belonged to me. Sometimes life gives you unexpected cards to play when you need them most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Fairfield. At 75 years old, I've collected more wisdom lines around my eyes than I care to count, but I've also gathered the kind of patience that only comes from decades of both triumph and heartbreak. I spent 46 years building Fairfield investments from my grandfather's modest real estate office into one of the most respected property development firms in New England. My late husband, Edward, died 12 years ago, leaving me to manage both our company and extensive properties alone. I didn't just manage, I thrived. The early April rain tapped steadily against my kitchen window as I prepared my morning coffee. Dark roast with a splash of cream, served in the delicate porcelain cup Edward had brought me from Vienna on our 30th anniversary. My spacious but comfortable home sat on a gentle hill overlooking Fairfield Estates, the prestigious neighborhood my grandfather had established in 1927, and that my father and I had carefully expanded over the decades. Few people remembered the connection between my surname and the community's name. Even fewer knew that through a series of carefully structured holding companies, I personally owned every square foot of the development. I preferred to keep my financial affairs private, a habit from decades of operating in a business world that rarely took women seriously. Discretion had become both my shield and my strategy. From my breakfast nook, I could just make out the graceful roofline of Caroline's house, a stately 7,000-square-foot Georgian revival at the end of Magnolia Drive. My daughter lived there, with her husband Richard and my 3 grandchildren, Alexandra, 17, Thomas, 14, and little Elizabeth, 9. I'd offered them the property at a substantially reduced rate 10 years ago when Richard's investment banking career was still building momentum. That was before his promotion to managing director, before the vacation home in the Hamptons, before Caroline started referring to household staff as the help. I'd always tried to keep Caroline grounded despite our family's wealth. Edward and I had insisted she work summer jobs in college, earn her own spending money, and understand the value of hard work that had built our family's success. Somewhere along the way, perhaps after marrying Richard with his old Boston money and social aspirations, those lessons had faded like photographs left too long in sunlight. The coffee warmed my arthritic hands as I scrolled through photos from Elizabeth's recent dance recital on my iPad. My heart swelled seeing her serious expression as she concentrated on her ballet positions. I'd been sitting in the 3rd row, recording every moment despite Caroline's obvious annoyance at my excessive documenting. The tension between us had been growing for years. Caroline increasingly embraced the role of sophisticated socialite, while I maintained the practical sensibilities of someone who remembered when Fairfield Estates had been more woodland than mansion. I kept showing up, kept trying to maintain connections with my grandchildren, kept hoping my daughter would remember the values I'd tried to instill. My phone chimed with a text message from Caroline. "Mother, we need to talk. Coming over at 10, nice." No pleasantries, no context, just a demand disguised as a request. I sighed, placed my cup in the sink, and headed to my study to review some property assessments before she arrived. The mahogany-paneled room held remnants of my professional life, certificates, awards, and photographs with governors and senators I'd worked with over the decades. Behind my desk hung my most prized possession, an original oil landscape depicting Fairfield Estates as it appeared in 1930, shortly after my grandfather had completed the first phase of development. The artist had captured perfectly the vision that had guided 3 generations of my family, a community that balanced natural beauty with architectural refinement. The doorbell rang precisely at 10 SAM. Caroline had inherited my punctuality, if not my perspective or humility. I opened the door to find my daughter looking flawless as always in her designer dress and pearl earrings, her chestnut hair falling in perfect waves around her shoulders. She'd inherited my height and Edward's green eyes, but the warmth that once filled those eyes had been replaced by something harder, more calculating. "Good morning, Caroline," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "Would you like some coffee?" "I don't have time," she replied, her voice clipped as she strode into my living room. She remained standing, making it clear this wouldn't be a lengthy visit. "I'll get straight to the point. Richard and I have been discussing our family situation, and we've made some decisions." The way she said family situation sent a chill through me. Corporate language for personal relationships never boded well. "What kind of decisions?" I asked, lowering myself onto my favorite armchair, the one with the perfect view of the garden on clear days. Caroline paced in front of my fireplace, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors. "We're planning significant renovations to our home, including converting the space above the garage into a private apartment." "That sounds extensive," I said carefully. "Are you thinking of having live-in help?" "Actually," she paused, turning. "To face me directly, we believe it would be best if you moved in there." I sat very still, certain I had misheard. "You want me to move into your garage apartment?" "It would be completely renovated," she continued, as if discussing a minor change in dinner plans. "Private entrance, kitchenette, everything you'd need. The stairs might be challenging, but Richard says the exercise would be good for you." "Caroline," I said slowly, "I have a home. This home, where I've lived for 40 years. She sighed dramatically. "Mother, be practical. This house is far too large for you to manage alone. You've been forgetting things," the gardener mentioned. "You missed your last payment, and last month you left the stove on after making tea." These were exaggerations at best, fabrications at worst. I'd disputed the gardener's invoice because he hadn't completed the work as agreed, and I hadn't used the stove for tea in years. I had an electric kettle specifically because it shut off automatically. "We're concerned about your safety living alone," she continued, her tone suggesting she'd rehearsed this conversation. "Alexandra will be leaving for college next year, so we'll have more space to look after you properly." "Look after me," I repeated, the words tasting bitter. "I see. It makes the most sense financially as well," Caroline added, warming to her topic now that the initial announcement was passed. "This house is valuable property in a prime location. The maintenance alone must be crushing your retirement savings. If you sell, you could live quite comfortably on the proceeds." I nearly laughed at the irony. My retirement savings included ownership of the very ground beneath her feet, along with the other 200 acres of Fairfield Estates. The yearly income from ground leases and property management fees alone was more than Richard earned at his prestigious banking position. "And what about my garden, my books, my privacy?" I asked. Caroline waved dismissively. "You can have a small container garden on the balcony. As for books, surely it's time to switch to a Kindle at your age, and you'll have plenty of privacy. The apartment is quite separate from the main house, but not separate enough to miss what was really happening. They wanted my house, not for my safety, but for their social advancement. The prestigious Fairfield address in the grandmother's name would be converted to the perfect guest house for their business associates and social connections." "When exactly were you hoping this transition would occur?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. "Renovations will start next month. We'd like you moved by the end of summer, before the fall social season begins." Caroline glanced at her watch. "Richard has already spoken with a real estate agent about listing this property. They believe it could sell quickly in this market. My mind raced through the implications. Caroline and Richard had no legal right to sell my home, which meant preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They were either staggeringly presumptuous or planning something more devious, perhaps trying to convince me I was no longer competent to manage my affairs. "I'll need time to consider this," I said finally. Caroline didn't wait for me to fully process her announcement. "There's nothing really to consider, Mother. It's the most practical solution for everyone. You can't manage alone much longer, and this way you'll be close to the grandchildren. The same grandchildren I've barely seen in the past 6 months, because your schedule is always too full for family dinners," I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. A flicker of discomfort crossed Caroline's perfectly made-up face before she regained her composure. "That's unfair. The children have demanding academic and extracurricular schedules. Excellence requires commitment." I wanted to point out that her house was exactly 1.4 miles from mine, that I'd offered to drive the children to their activities countless times, that I'd been excluded from Thomas's last 3 lacrosse games despite being the one who taught him to catch and throw. Instead, I bit my tongue, knowing such reminders would only widen the gulf between us. "What exactly are you asking of me, Caroline?" I finally said. She stopped pacing and looked directly at me, her jaw set in a determined line. "Richard and I have decided it would be best if you downsize to a more appropriate living situation. The garage apartment provides the perfect solution. You'll have independence but support when needed. The real estate market is strong, so selling this house now makes financial sense." "And if I don't agree to this plan?" Caroline's expression hardened further. "Then we'll need to consider other arrangements for your care. Richard's mother is in a lovely assisted living facility in Connecticut. They have openings." The room seemed to tilt slightly. I gripped the arms of my chair to steady myself. "You would place me in a facility because I refuse to give up my home?" "It's not about giving up your home," she corrected, using that detached, therapist-approved language she'd adopted in recent years. "It's about accepting appropriate care as you age. Your forgetfulness is concerning, and we've noticed you're not maintaining the property as you once did." I looked around at my immaculate living room, the gardens visible through the window that I still tended myself 3 days a week, despite arthritis in my knees. The forgetfulness she mentioned amounted to missing one lunch date last month because I was in a property negotiation that ran long, a $4.2 million deal I'd closed successfully, though Caroline knew nothing of my continued business activities. "I see," I said, struggling to keep my composure. "And have you discussed this with the children? Do they understand why their grandmother is suddenly going to be living above your garage?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Caroline's face. "We'll explain it in an age-appropriate way. They'll understand it's for the best." "How convenient," I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "I'm sure they'll find that explanation completely satisfying when they're visiting their grandmother in what used to be Gregory's quarters." Gregory had been their chauffeur until Richard decided they needed someone younger last year. Caroline sighed dramatically, glancing at her Cartier watch. "This is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation I'm talking about. You always position yourself as the victim when practical decisions need to be made." I nearly laughed at the absurdity. Emotional manipulation? I'm stating a simple truth. My grandchildren will find it strange to visit me in the servants' quarters, regardless of how you frame it. "I need to go," she said, already moving toward the door. "I have a fundraising committee meeting at 11:30. Think about what I've said, Mother. This doesn't have to be contentious if you're willing to be reasonable." She paused with her hand on the doorknob. "We can talk again next week about the timeline, and—" Then she was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of her expensive perfume and the devastating reality of her ultimatum. I remained in my chair, too stunned to move. Outside, the clouds had thickened, and rain was now falling in earnest, mirroring the storm within me. I'd faced many challenges in my life, building a business in a male-dominated industry, losing Edward too early to cancer, navigating widowhood, and the loneliness it brought. But nothing had prepared me for this hollow feeling of having my own child dismiss my autonomy so completely. After what felt like hours, I finally rose and moved to my study on unsteady legs. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick leather portfolio labeled Fairfield Holdings, Complete Asset Documentation. Inside were the legal documents confirming my ownership of not just my own home, but every property in Fairfield Estates, including Caroline and Richard's Georgian revival. My grandfather had established the neighborhood with a unique structure. He retained ownership of the land while selling long-term leases on the properties, typically 99-year terms. My father had continued this approach, and when I took over Fairfield Investments, I'd modernized the contracts, but maintained the fundamental ownership model. Current residents owned their homes but leased the land beneath them, a detail buried in the fine print of their thick property documents. Caroline's house was different. When she and Richard had expressed interest in the property 10 years ago, I'd created a special arrangement. They paid a reduced price for the house itself, and I'd gifted them what appeared to be ownership of the land. In reality, the land was held by the Margaret Fairfield Living Trust, which I controlled completely. The gift could be revoked under certain conditions spelled out in paragraph 23 of the agreement, conditions including any attempt to force me from my own home. I hadn't kept these details from Caroline out of malice or manipulation. I simply believed that financial independence was important, that she and Richard needed to feel they'd achieved their success on their own merits. Perhaps that had been a mistake. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. The screen showed my friend, Harriet's name. Harriet had been my closest friend since our college days at Wellesley. She lived just 4 houses down from Caroline in Fairfield Estates, a coincidence Caroline believed was due to Harriet following her there, never suspecting I had offered Harriet the property at a significant discount after her husband passed away. "Maggie, are you there?" Harriet's concerned voice came through when I answered but didn't immediately speak. "Yes, I'm here," I said, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "What's wrong? You sound terrible." The simple question broke the eye. Damn. Tears I'd been holding back spilled over as I recounted Caroline's visit and ultimatum. "Oh, Maggie," Harriet sighed when I finished. "I actually saw her car at your house and wondered what was happening. She seemed in quite a hurry when she left." "She's always in a hurry these days," I said, wiping my eyes. Too busy with her perfect life to consider anyone else's feelings, especially her mother's. "What are you going to do?" Harriet asked. I looked down at the property documents spread across my desk, a plan slowly forming in my mind. "I'm going to think very carefully about my next steps," I said. "And I may need your help." "Whatever you need," Harriet said without hesitation. "You know I'm here for you." After hanging up with Harriet, I spent the afternoon reviewing my options as the legal owner of Fairfield Estates. The land ownership structure my grandfather had created now provided me with significant leverage, a fact Caroline was completely unaware of. But wielding that power required careful consideration. I didn't want to destroy my relationship with my daughter. I wanted to repair it. I didn't want to use my ownership as a weapon, but rather as a way to open her eyes to some hard truths about respect, family, and the legacy she seemed to have forgotten. That evening, as darkness fell over the neighborhood I'd helped shape across 3 decades, I made a decision. I would not accept being relegated to the servants' quarters like an inconvenient heirloom tucked away in an attic. I would not allow Caroline's misguided affluenza to sever the bonds I'd formed with Alexandra, Thomas, and Elizabeth. But neither would I storm in with threats and revelations that might cause irreparable damage. Instead, I would build my case carefully and strategically, gathering allies and evidence. I would give Caroline one chance to reconsider her position before I revealed the truth about who really controlled the roof over her head, the private school her children attended, and the country club she so proudly claimed as the center of her social universe. I pulled out my address book and began making calls to other residents of Fairfield Estates, my tenants, though they didn't know it. Many were longtime friends who had no idea of my connection to the property. Others were newer residents who knew me only as Caroline's mother, or as the older woman who chaired the community garden committee. By midnight, I had spoken with 8 families and arranged coffee with 3 key members of the Homeowners Association, an organization I technically owned, but had always allowed to function independently as part of my hands-off management approach. As I finally prepared for bed, I caught sight of my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me appeared tired, the lines around her eyes deeper than usual, but there was also a familiar determination in her gaze, a spark that had built a financial empire from nothing. Caroline had never truly seen that woman, the strategist, the businesswoman, the survivor. She'd only seen the mother she believed had become obsolete, a relic from another era whose time had passed. Soon my daughter would come to understand that I was both the mother who wanted the best for her children and the formidable woman who had created much more than she'd ever acknowledged. And if that understanding came with the revelation that her perfect Georgian revival house was built on foundations I had laid, quite literally, then perhaps that was a lesson she needed to learn. I turned off the light and slipped into bed, my mind still churning with plans. Tomorrow would be the first day of my careful campaign to reclaim my dignity and secure my place in my grandchildren's lives. And unlike Caroline, I had the patience, resources, and determination to play the long game. As I drifted toward sleep, one thought provided surprising comfort. Caroline had always underestimated me. It was time she learned that was a serious mistake. The next morning dawned with unusual clarity for early spring in New England. I rose before sunrise, a habit from decades in the real estate world where early risers claimed the best opportunities. My morning ritual remained unchanged despite the emotional earthquake of yesterday. Stretching exercises for my arthritis, a light breakfast of steel-cut oats with berries, and a review of property listings on my tablet. But today, alongside my normal routine, I opened a leather-bound notebook and began mapping out my strategy. If there was one thing 46 years in property development had taught me, it was that emotion-driven decisions rarely yielded optimal results. I needed to approach this situation with the same analytical precision I'd applied to multi-million-dollar acquisitions throughout my career. My doorbell rang precisely at 8:30. Harriet stood on my porch immaculately dressed as always, a thermal carafe in one hand and a folder in the other. "I brought reinforcements," she said, holding up the carafe. "My special blend, and I dug up some interesting information you might find useful." We settled at my kitchen table, the morning light streaming through the windows. At 77, Harriet remained sharp as ever. Before retirement, she'd been a formidable corporate attorney, and that investigative instinct had never faded. "I've been thinking about your situation with Caroline," she said, pouring us each a cup of coffee. "And I wonder if you've considered what's really driving this sudden ultimatum. Has anything changed recently in their household?" I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, considering her question. Richard was passed over for the managing partner position last month, and Caroline's been appointed to the board of the Fairfield County Arts Foundation, a position she's been coveting for years. "Sometimes success creates its own pressures," Harriet observed, "especially when it's more about appearance than substance." She was right, of course. Caroline and Richard had struggled financially during their first years of marriage, even with my substantial but discreet support. Their ascent to upper echelon comfort had been relatively recent and partially facilitated by my unseen hand. The Georgian Revival House, the children's private school tuition, the country club membership that Caroline treasured, all had been made possible through my careful financial orchestration, always disguised as their own achievement. "There's something else," Harriet said, opening the folder she'd brought. I've been keeping my ear to the ground at homeowners association meetings. The Andersons mentioned that Caroline has been pushing for stricter enforcement of the senior living guidelines. Specifically, she wants to restrict older residents without full-time care from living alone in the neighborhood. I nearly spilled my coffee. She's trying to create a policy to force me out? Harriet nodded grimly. The proposal would require residents over 70 living alone to have daily caregiver visits or move to more appropriate accommodations. She's framing it as a safety measure, but several residents have mentioned it seems targeted. The calculated nature of Caroline's actions hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just setting boundaries within her own home. She was attempting to institutionalize my exclusion from the entire community. When is this proposal being voted on? I asked, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. Next Thursday's meeting, Harriet replied, taking a sip of her coffee. Caroline doesn't know I'm aware of your ownership of the properties, of course. She's been quite condescending when explaining the proposal to me, suggesting that at my age, I might not understand modern liability concerns. I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Caroline patronizing Harriet, one of the sharpest legal minds I'd ever known, about rules for a community I actually owned. Who else serves on the current board? I asked, reaching for my notebook. James. Foster is president. You remember the retired surgeon. Then there's Diane Abernathy, Caroline, of course, Richard Chen, and that young tech entrepreneur who bought the Wilsons' old place. Zoe something. Zoe Levinson, I supplied. Her daughter is in Elizabeth's ballet class. We've chatted at recitals. I made a few notes. How do they seem to be leaning on Caroline's proposal? James and Richard seem skeptical. Diane follows Caroline's lead on everything. Zoe hasn't indicated her position. Harriet leaned forward. But here's the interesting part. Caroline has been hosting little pre-meeting gatherings at her house. Very exclusive. I suspect she's building support for more than just this senior living policy. My pen paused over the paper. What else? There's talk of extensive renovations to the community center, new restrictions on property modifications, substantial increases to the annual fees. Harriet raised an eyebrow. Changes that would require significant financial commitments from homeowners. The picture became clearer. Caroline wasn't just asserting control over her aging mother. She was positioning herself as a power broker in the community, a community she had no idea I controlled. I need to attend that homeowners meeting, I said decisively. Harriet looked concerned. Caroline might see that as a direct challenge. It could escalate the situation. I won't be confrontational, I assured her. I'll simply attend as a concerned community member. After all, many of the residents are friends I've known for years. It wouldn't be unusual for me to take an interest. We spent the next hour developing our approach. Harriet would continue gathering information about Caroline's other initiatives. I would reconnect with key residents who might provide insight or support. We would both attend Thursday's meeting but separately to avoid raising suspicions. As Harriet prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Maggie, have you considered the possibility that you might have to reveal your ownership of Fairfield Estates? That's a significant card to play. I nodded solemnly. It's my nuclear option, Harriet. I'll only use it if absolutely necessary. I want Caroline to recognize my place in my grandchildren's lives because she understands its value to them, not because I've forced her hand with property rights. After Harriet left, I dressed carefully in a casual but elegant outfit, tailored navy slacks, a crisp white blouse, and my favorite sapphire pendant that Edward had given me for our 40th anniversary. If I was going to begin making strategic appearances around the community, I wanted to project confidence and composure. My first stop was the small shopping plaza at the entrance to Fairfield Estates. The Morning Glory Cafe served as the unofficial community hub, a place where residents gathered to exchange news and opinions. The owner, Sophia, had been one of my first commercial tenants when I developed the plaza 20 years ago, though, like most, she believed she was leasing from an anonymous property management company. The cafe was bustling with mid-morning customers when I arrived. Sophia spotted me from behind the counter and immediately came over to greet me with a warm hug. "Mrs. Fairfield? It's been too long since you visited us," she said, leading me to a small table by the window. "I've been keeping to myself a bit lately," I admitted. "But I've missed your almond croissants." "Say no more," Sophia winked, disappearing briefly, before returning with a still warm croissant and a pot of Earl Grey tea. On the house for one of my favorite customers. As I enjoyed my tea, several residents stopped by my table to chat. Martin and Julia Lee, a retired couple who lived near the community garden, updated me on this year's planting plans. Catherine Fleming, a young mother of twins, thanked me again for the children's books I'd sent when her babies were born. Even the usually reserved Dr. Foster paused to inquire about my health and mentioned he was looking forward to seeing me at community events again. In each conversation, I gently steered the topic toward the upcoming homeowners meeting and the proposed changes. The reactions were illuminating. Most residents seemed unaware of the details of Caroline's senior living policy proposal, but several expressed concern about rumors of increased fees and restrictions. "Between us," Dr. Foster said in a lowered voice, "I'm not convinced these changes are necessary. The community has functioned well for years with our current guidelines, but Caroline can be quite persuasive." I nodded understandingly. "Change isn't always improvement, is it, James? Especially when something is working well already." He seemed relieved by my response. "Precisely. Perhaps you could attend the meeting. You've always had a practical perspective on these matters." "I'll do my best to be there," I promised, suppressing a smile at how perfectly he'd played into my plans. By noon, I'd spoken with 7 influential community members, planting subtle seeds of doubt about the necessity of Caroline's proposals, without directly criticizing my daughter. It was a delicate balance. I needed to build opposition to her restrictive policies without turning neighbors against her personally. As I prepared to leave, Sophia approached with a small box of additional croissants for later. She hesitated, then spoke in a hushed tone. "Mrs. Fairfield, I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but your granddaughter Elizabeth was here yesterday. With her nanny. She seemed quite upset, asking when she would see you again. The nanny tried to distract her, but—" Sophia shrugged sympathetically. "Children notice more than adults think." My heart tightened. "Thank you for telling me, Sophia. Elizabeth and I are very close." "We all know what a wonderful grandmother you are," she said firmly. "The children from the neighborhood love when you host cookie decorating at Christmas and your storytelling afternoons in the gazebo. It would be a shame if those traditions ended." I clutched the box of pastries, fighting back sudden tears. In my strategic planning, I'd momentarily lost sight of the immediate emotional impact on my grandchildren. Elizabeth was asking for me. She was confused and hurt by my sudden absence. "The traditions won't end," I assured Sophia with newfound determination. "Some things are too important to lose." I left the cafe with renewed purpose and a modified plan forming in my mind. The homeowners' meeting was still days away. I couldn't wait that long to establish some form of contact with my grandchildren. Back at home, I retrieved a carved wooden box from my bedroom shelf. Inside were 3 small, sapphire pendants similar to the one I wore, but sized for younger wearers. I'd purchased them years ago, planning to give them to my grandchildren when they were older. But circumstances had changed. I carefully wrapped each pendant in tissue paper and placed them in individual gift boxes with handwritten notes. For Alexandra, the eldest. "Strong women know their worth. Wear this as a reminder of yours." For Thomas, "Your curious mind will take you far. This stone represents wisdom." And for Elizabeth, "Remember that Grandma's love is always with you, just like this special stone." Next, I selected 3 books from my library, thoughtfully chosen for each child's interests and reading level. For Alexandra, a beautifully illustrated biography of pioneering women in architecture and design, her current passion. For Thomas, an engaging book about marine biology. He'd been fascinated by oceanic ecosystems since our trip to the aquarium last year. For Elizabeth, a collection of fairy tales featuring brave, kind heroines. I hesitated before packaging these gifts. Caroline had explicitly forbidden extravagant presents, but these weren't electronic gadgets or sugar-laden treats. They were meaningful keepsakes and educational books. Still, delivering them required careful consideration. I couldn't take them to Caroline's house directly. That would provoke an immediate confrontation. I couldn't send them with Harriet without potentially drawing her into the conflict. After careful thought, I realized there was one perfect opportunity. Thomas's swim meet tomorrow afternoon at the Fairfield Country Club. Caroline never attended these competitions, claiming they interfered with her charity committee meetings. Richard typically took all 3 children, with the girls watching from the observation deck while Thomas competed. If I timed my appearance correctly, I could briefly connect with my grandchildren in a public setting where a scene would be difficult to create. That evening, I called my grandson directly on the child-friendly phone Richard had given him for emergencies. Thomas answered on the second ring. "Grandma!" His excited voice filled me with joy. "Where have you been? Mom said you were busy with some projects." "I've been thinking about you all," I said carefully. "I understand I won't be visiting as often for a while, but I wanted to check if you'll be at the swim meet tomorrow." "Yeah, Dad's taking us. Mom has some fundraiser thing." His voice lowered conspiratorially. "Elizabeth keeps asking when you're coming over. She cried last night because you weren't here for your special Tuesday story time." My heart clenched, but I kept my tone light. "Well, I might stop by the country club tomorrow to cheer for you. Perhaps I'll see you all there." "Really?" Thomas sounded thrilled. "That would be awesome. I'll tell Alexandra and Elizabeth." "Actually," I said quickly, "let's make it a surprise, shall we? Sometimes surprises are more fun." After we hung up, I sat in my garden watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The same sky stretched over Caroline's house just a few streets away. My daughter believed she was protecting her social standing by removing me from her immediate circle, but all she was doing was depriving her children of a loving presence in their lives. Tomorrow would be my first small countermove in this painful chess match. Not an aggressive attack, but a gentle reminder that I wouldn't simply disappear from my grandchildren's lives without resistance. The Fairfield Country Club swimming complex bustled with activity when I arrived the following afternoon. Parents and grandparents lined the viewing area as teams of preteen boys prepared for their competition. I spotted Thomas immediately in his blue team swimsuit, his lanky frame reflecting his recent growth spurt as he focused intently on his coach's instructions. I deliberately positioned myself on the opposite side from where Richard stood with the girls, giving myself time to assess the situation. Richard appeared distracted, alternating between watching Thomas warm up and responding to messages on his phone. Alexandra had her nose buried in a book, while Elizabeth sat on a bench looking bored and fidgety. Perfect. I approached Elizabeth, first, moving casually along the periphery until I reached her bench. Her face lit up like sunshine breaking through clouds when she spotted me. "Grandma!" she squealed, launching herself into my arms. I hugged her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Hello, my sweet girl. I've missed you." "Mommy said you're too busy to visit," Elizabeth said with a frown. "Are you too busy for me?" "Never," I assured her, sitting beside her on the bench. "I am never, ever too busy for you. Sometimes grown-ups have complicated disagreements, but it doesn't change how much I love you." Elizabeth nodded solemnly as if this made perfect sense. "Mommy and Daddy have disagreements too. Sometimes Daddy sleeps in the guest room." This was interesting information that I carefully filed away. "That happens sometimes in families, but today I brought you a special surprise." I discreetly handed her the smallest gift box. This is a very special stone that reminds me of you. You can keep it somewhere safe or wear it, but it means that my love is always with you. Elizabeth's eyes widened as she opened the box and discovered the sapphire pendant. It's so pretty, like your necklace. Exactly like mine, I smiled. Now, could you quietly let Thomas know I'm here? I have something for him too. Elizabeth nodded eagerly and skipped toward the pool area. Moments later, Alexandra approached, trying to act casual but unable to contain her curiosity. "Grandma," she said, attempting to sound nonchalant as she sat beside me. "Elizabeth said you were here? I thought you were taking a break from family stuff." I noticed she couldn't quite meet my eyes, a sign she was repeating someone else's words rather than expressing her own thoughts. "I would never take a break from my grandchildren," I said simply. "I've brought you something I thought you might enjoy." I handed her the package with the book and pendant. Alexandra unwrapped the book first, her eyes lighting up at the cover. "This is perfect. I just did my history presentation on female architects." Then she opened the small jewelry box, examining the sapphire pendant with a more measured reaction. "Is this expensive?" "It's meaningful," I corrected. "I have one very similar. I thought you might like to have something that connects us, even when we can't see each other as often." She turned the pendant over in her palm, considering. "Mom says you're always trying to buy our affection with gifts." The accusation stung, but I kept my expression neutral. "Do you believe that's true, Alexandra? In your heart? Do you think that's why I give you things?" She thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No. You give us stuff you think we'll actually like or use. Mom and Dad just buy whatever is trending." She slipped the pendant into her pocket rather than wearing it. "I should get back. Thomas's event is starting soon." "Of course." I reached out and squeezed her hand briefly. "And Alexandra, if you ever need to talk, you can always call me, no matter what your mother says." As Alexandra returned to her seat, I noticed Richard finally looking in my direction. His expression registered surprise, then concern, but not anger. He gave me a slight nod of acknowledgement before turning his attention back to the pool where Thomas was preparing to compete. That small gesture gave me hope. Perhaps Richard wasn't fully aligned with Caroline's extreme position. It was something to explore further. I remained for the rest of the swim meet, cheering appropriately when Thomas won second place in his freestyle event. As the families began to disperse afterward, I deliberately made my exit before Richard could approach me. With the children, this brief contact had accomplished what I needed, reassuring my grandchildren of my continued presence in their lives without directly challenging Caroline's authority. As I walked back to my car, I felt someone fall into step beside me. It was Richard Chen, one of the Homeowners Association board members Harriet had mentioned. "Mrs. Fairfield," he greeted me politely. "Good to see you supporting the community teams. Thomas swims very well." "He's dedicated," I replied. "I wouldn't miss it." Richard nodded, then lowered his voice. "I understand there may be some family tension regarding your role in the community. I wanted you to know that not everyone agrees with the proposed restrictions." I maintained a neutral expression, though inwardly I was surprised by his directness. "I appreciate that, Richard. I've been part of Fairfield Estates for a long time," he said with a meaningful look. "Longer than most realize. My firm handled some of the original property transfers 2 decades ago. I've always respected your decision to remain anonymous. My steps faltered slightly. Richard knew about my ownership. This was unexpected. He smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry. Your secret has been safe with me for 15 years. I simply wanted you to know that should you choose to attend Thursday's meeting, you would have support from some board members." "Thank you, Richard," I said carefully. "That's good to know." As he walked away, I processed this new information. Richard Chen knew about my ownership of Fairfield Estates, but had kept that knowledge private for years. He was offering an alliance against Caroline's proposals, without requiring me to reveal my ownership publicly. The chessboard had just become more complex and potentially more advantageous for my position. When I returned home, I found Harriet waiting on my porch with a large envelope and a concerned expression. "I've been trying to reach you," she said as I unlocked the door. "Something's happened that you need to know about." Once inside, Harriet spread several documents across my kitchen table. "These were anonymously delivered to my mailbox this morning. They're copies of emails between Caroline and an attorney specializing in elder law and conservatorships." My blood ran cold as I scanned the documents. The emails detailed Caroline's inquiries about having me declared mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs, with references to increasing signs of poor judgment and financially irresponsible decisions. "She's building a case to take control of my assets," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. "It appears so," Harriet confirmed grimly. "And based on these dates, she's been planning this for months, long before yesterday's confrontation about moving you to the garage apartment." I sank into a chair, trying to process this new dimension of Caroline's betrayal. My own daughter wasn't just trying to relegate me to servants' quarters. She was actively plotting to seize control of my finances under the guise of protecting me from myself. "Does she have any idea about Fairfield Estates?" I asked, trying to think clearly through the shock. "I don't believe so," Harriet said. "These emails reference your retirement accounts and primary residence. There's no mention of property investments or the management company." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think strategically rather than emotionally. Who would have access to these emails, and why send them to you rather than directly to me? Harriet considered this. It could be someone from her attorney's office with ethical concerns, or perhaps someone close to Caroline who disagrees with her approach. She hesitated. Possibly even Richard. The thought that Richard might be trying to warn me provided a glimmer of hope in an otherwise devastating revelation. He had always been more reasonable than Caroline, more willing to see multiple perspectives. If he was beginning to question her actions, that could be significant. "What's your next move?" Harriet asked quietly. I gathered the scattered documents into a neat pile, my resolve hardening. Thursday's homeowners meeting has just taken on much greater importance. Caroline isn't just trying to limit my presence in the community. She's laying groundwork for a larger power play. "Will you reveal your ownership?" Harriet pressed. I shook my head. "Not yet. First, I need to understand exactly who I can trust. Richard Chen approached me at the swim meet today. Apparently, he's known about my ownership for years." Harriet's eyebrows shot up. "That's unexpected. Could he be the one who sent these?" "Possibly. Or it could be someone else entirely." I stood and moved to the window, looking out toward the community I had built. Before I make my final decision, I need more information, and I need to speak with Richard privately. Arranging a private meeting with Richard proved easier than I anticipated. The following morning, I sent a text message directly to his personal phone. "Richard, I need to speak with you about a matter that affects both our family and the community. Can we meet privately? No accusations, just information you should have. Margaret." His response came within minutes. "Henley's Coffee. Downtown 1 p.m. I have a client meeting nearby." The directness of his reply suggested he had been expecting, perhaps even hoping for this contact. I spent the morning reviewing the conservatorship documents Harriet had provided, making careful notes of dates, specific language, and the name of the attorney Caroline had consulted. Knowledge was power, especially when dealing with legal maneuvers. Henley's Coffee occupied the ground floor of a renovated Victorian in downtown Fairfield. The exposed brick, soaring ceilings, and carefully distressed furniture created an atmosphere of cultivated casualness that appealed to the professionals who frequently held informal meetings there. I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a corner table that offered both privacy and a clear view of the entrance. Richard arrived precisely at 1, dressed in his typical understated elegance, a charcoal suit that projected authority without ostentation. At 45, he maintained the attentive demeanor and thoughtful presence that Caroline had first been attracted to when they met at a charity gala 15 years ago. As he approached my table, I noted the shadows beneath his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. Whatever was happening at their household was taking its toll on him as well. "Margaret," Richard greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek before sitting down. "Thank you for reaching out." "Thank you for coming," I replied. "I ordered you a macchiato. You still take it that way?" A flicker of surprise crossed his face at this small consideration. "Yes, thank you." He took a careful sip, then set the cup down and met my gaze directly. "I assume this is about Caroline's decision regarding your living arrangements." "Partly," I acknowledged, "but there's more to discuss." "Richard, before we begin, I want to know where you stand on this relocation plan. Is this a united front or Caroline's initiative?" Richard's gaze dropped to his cup. He was silent for a long moment before answering. "It's complicated. Caroline believes she's protecting the family image and social standing. I think she's overreacting. But," he sighed, "our marriage has been strained lately. I'm trying to pick my battles. And my relationship with my grandchildren isn't worth fighting for?" I kept my tone neutral, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. He looked up, pained. "The children miss you terribly. Alexandra barely speaks at home now. Thomas keeps asking when rules can be broken for special circumstances. And Elizabeth—" He shook his head. "Elizabeth cried herself to sleep the first 2 nights. My heart ached for my grandchildren, but I pressed on. Richard, I need to show you something." I slid the copies of Caroline's emails across the table. These were anonymously delivered to Harriet yesterday. Quite detailed plans about my supposed mental decline. Richard's expression shifted from confusion to shock as he scanned the documents. His face paled visibly. Conservatorship? Mental incompetence? Margaret, I had no idea she was pursuing this. His reaction appeared genuine. The tightening around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands as he turned the pages. Either Richard was an exceptional actor, or he was truly blindsided by this revelation. "You didn't know?" I pressed gently. "No." He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "God, no. I knew she was frustrated about what she calls your interference with the children. But this?" He gestured at the papers. "This is extreme. Has Caroline mentioned concerns about my mental capacity to you or others?" I needed to understand how far this narrative had spread. Richard shook his head firmly. "Never. In fact, she often complains that you're too sharp, too aware of family dynamics, that you see through her attempts to—" He stopped abruptly. "Attempts to what, Richard?" He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "To establish herself as the authority figure, to be seen as the successful one." He looked directly at me. "Caroline has always felt she lives in your shadow, Margaret. Your confidence, your natural grace with the children. She wants to be the matriarch, not the daughter still seeking approval." This insight wasn't entirely surprising, but hearing it articulated so clearly brought a wave of sadness. I had never intended to overshadow Caroline. My support had always been offered with the hope of seeing her thrive. "Have you noticed other concerning behaviors?" I asked. "Beyond the restrictions regarding my visits?" Richard's expression turned guarded. "What exactly are you asking?" "I'm asking if Caroline has been making choices that seem motivated by control, rather than care. Decisions that prioritize appearance over substance." He was quiet for nearly a minute, clearly weighing his loyalty to his wife against growing concerns. Finally, he spoke in a lowered voice. "The Homeowners Association has become an obsession. She's been hosting these elaborate dinner parties for board members and influential residents. We can't really afford them, but she insists they're necessary for community standing." He looked troubled. "She's becoming fixated on who belongs, who doesn't meet the community standards. And financially?" I probed gently. Richard's shoulders slumped slightly. "My firm is doing well, but not as well as Caroline presents to others. The Morgan account fell through last quarter. We've been living beyond our means for months." He looked up, his expression both embarrassed and defiant. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to confirm your concerns about my ability to provide for the family." "I've never doubted your abilities, Richard," I said softly. "Only your willingness to check Caroline's more extreme impulses." He winced at that. "Fair enough." He tapped the conservatorship documents. "Do you know who sent these?" "No," I answered honestly. "But someone clearly felt I needed to be warned." Richard nodded slowly. "I suspect I know who. Caroline's assistant. At the foundation, Jennifer. She's been uncomfortable with some of Caroline's recent behavior. She mentioned ethical concerns when she gave notice last week. That was valuable information. Jennifer might be another potential ally, or at least a source of insight into Caroline's plans. There's something else you should know," Richard continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Caroline has been discussing a significant renovation of our home with a contractor. Premium materials, expanded footprint, high-end finishes. When I questioned how we would pay for it, she said not to worry, that soon we would have access to family resources that had been unnecessarily tied up." A chill ran through me. The implication was clear. Caroline was already planning how to spend my money once she gained control of it. "One last question," I said carefully. "Has Caroline ever mentioned anything about the ownership of Fairfield Estates? The community itself?" Richard looked puzzled. "Only that the development is managed by some investment group. She's complained occasionally about not being able to meet the actual owners to discuss her vision for community improvements." He studied my face. "Why do you ask?" I made a split-second decision. "Richard, what I'm about to tell you must remain in absolute confidence. Not even the children can know yet." He straightened, his full attention engaged. "Of course. I own Fairfield Estates. All of it. The residential properties, the commercial spaces, the country club, everything. I developed it through a separate management company that deliberately keeps my name off public records." Richard stared at me, stunned into silence. After several moments, he managed, "The entire community? Caroline has no idea?" "No one does, except my attorney, Harriet Thompson, and apparently Richard Chen from the homeowners board." I watched his face carefully. "And now you." Richard ran a hand through his hair, processing this revelation. "This changes everything," he said finally. "If Caroline knew, she would either attempt to leverage it or resent me even more for having this power." I completed his thought. "Which is why I'm telling you in confidence. I need to know if I can trust you, Richard, not just with this information, but with helping me maintain my relationship with my grandchildren." He sat straighter, a new resoluteness in his expression. "The children need you in their lives, Margaret. I've always known that, even when I failed to stand up for it." He took a deep breath. "What do you need from me?" "First, advance notice of any legal moves Caroline makes regarding conservatorship. Second, regular updates about the children. And third," I leaned forward, "your support, or at least your neutrality, at Thursday's homeowners meeting." "The senior living policy?" Richard nodded. "Yes, I can do all three. But Margaret, you should know. If Caroline suspects I'm working with you, she might accelerate her plans." "Then we'll need to be cautious," I agreed. "And Richard, thank you for meeting me today." He gathered the conservatorship documents and handed them back to me. "These will disappear from her files tonight. It might buy us some time. He stood to leave, then hesitated. The children were wearing the sapphire pendants this morning. Elizabeth showed me hers, said it was a special secret from you. I tensed, uncertain how he would react to my circumvention of Caroline's gift restrictions. To my surprise, a small smile touched his lips. Good. They need tangible reminders that you're still there for them. With that, he turned and left the coffee shop, walking with a slightly straighter posture than when he'd arrived. I remained at the table, contemplating our conversation. Richard's support was a significant development, but it also increased the stakes. If Caroline discovered his involvement, it could fracture their marriage beyond repair, potentially harming the children in the process. As I gathered my things to leave, my phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. Mrs. Fairfield, this is Jennifer Martin, formerly Caroline's assistant. I believe we need to talk. Can we meet somewhere? Private today? Another piece moving on the board. I responded immediately. My home, 4 p.m. today. The address is 24 Oakleaf Lane. On the drive home, I mentally recalibrated my strategy. With Richard and potentially Jennifer as allies, I had more information and influence than I'd initially realized. But Caroline's conservatorship plan represented a more immediate threat than I'd anticipated. Thursday's homeowners meeting was no longer just about maintaining access to my grandchildren. It was about protecting my autonomy and assets from a daughter who seemed determined to control both. Jennifer Martin arrived at my home precisely at 4, driving a modest sedan that she parked carefully on the street rather than in my driveway, a subtle precaution against being recognized by neighbors who might report back to Caroline. She was younger than I expected, perhaps early 30s, with a practical bob haircut and the alert, efficient demeanor of someone accustomed to anticipating others' needs. "Thank you for meeting with me, Mrs. Fairfield," she said, as I welcomed her inside. "I apologize for the secrecy, but the situation is delicate." "I understand completely," I assured her, leading her to my sunroom where I'd prepared tea and a light arrangement of cookies. "And please call me Margaret." Jennifer settled onto the wicker sofa, her posture professional despite the informal setting. "I worked for your daughter for 3 years at the Fairfield County Arts Foundation. Initially, it was a position I valued. Meaningful work, good experience." She paused. "But over the past 6 months, things changed significantly." "In what way?" I asked, pouring tea for both of us. "Caroline began using foundation resources for personal networking, directing me to handle private matters during work hours, asking me to adjust expense reports to cover personal lunches." Jennifer accepted the teacup with a nod of thanks. "I raised concerns with the executive director, but Caroline is well connected." Nothing came of it. "What prompted your resignation?" Jennifer's expression hardened. 3 weeks ago, Caroline asked me to compile information about you. Financial records, property holdings, medical history. She claimed it was for estate planning purposes, but the attorney she connected me with specialized in elder law and competency cases. When I questioned the approach, she became defensive, then threatening. Threatening how? I kept my voice neutral. She implied my career in nonprofit administration would be over in Fairfield County if I didn't cooperate. Jennifer met my gaze directly. I submitted my resignation the next day, but not before I made copies of the correspondence regarding the competency evaluation. "You sent the documents to Harriet Thompson," I said. Not a question, but a confirmation. Jennifer nodded. "I found her name in Caroline's contacts list as your friend. I thought she might be able to warn you discreetly." "Why take this risk? You don't know me personally." She carefully set down her teacup. "My grandmother raised me after my parents died when I was in college. My uncle tried to have her declared incompetent to gain control of her modest savings. I've seen this playbook before and I couldn't be part of it." Her personal connection to the situation explained her willingness to become involved. "I appreciate your integrity, Jennifer. What else can you tell me about Caroline's plans?" She's been coordinating with 3 specific board members of the Homeowners Association, Diane Abernathy, Martin Wells, and Victoria Simmons. They meet regularly to discuss what they call community standards enforcement. Jennifer pulled a small notebook from her bag. I have dates, topics, and proposed policy changes, including the senior living restrictions targeted at you. I recognized the other 2 names. Martin Wells was a retired banking executive who had moved to Fairfield Estates only 2 years ago, and Victoria Simmons was a real estate agent who had always been slightly too deferential to Caroline. Both would be present at Thursday's meeting. There's more, Jennifer continued. Caroline has been discussing property values and investment potential with these board members. She's particularly focused on the country club renovation as a way to justify significant increases in association fees. To what end? I wondered aloud. Based on what I overheard, they're trying to price out some of the original residents, the retirees and middle-income families who bought in early. They want to transform Fairfield into an exclusive enclave. Jennifer looked troubled. Caroline specifically mentioned that certain elements were bringing down property values. The implications were disturbing. Caroline wasn't just trying to exclude me. She was attempting to reshape the entire community into a more elite, exclusive environment. The diverse, multi-generational neighborhood my grandfather had carefully designed was being targeted for improvement by my own daughter. The meeting, on Thursday, I said. What do you know about their strategy? They plan to present the senior living policy as a safety measure, citing recent health emergencies in neighboring communities. The fee increases will be framed as necessary investments in community infrastructure. Jennifer hesitated. And Caroline has prepared a statement about resident conduct standards that indirectly references disruptive family situations affecting community harmony. She's going to publicly suggest I'm creating family drama, I translated. Essentially, yes. Jennifer looked apologetic. She's been quite strategic about building her support base. For the next hour, Jennifer shared everything she knew about Caroline's plans, the allies she'd cultivated, the policies she hoped to implement, and the narrative she'd constructed about my supposedly declining judgment. The picture that emerged was of a daughter determined to assert control at any cost, using the Homeowners Association as a vehicle for her ambitions, while simultaneously laying groundwork to seize my assets. As our meeting concluded, I walked Jennifer to the door. Thank you for taking this risk, I said sincerely. You've provided invaluable information. She straightened her shoulders. I believe in doing what's right, even when it's difficult. My grandmother raised me that way. She handed me a business card. I've included my personal contact information. Please let me know if there's anything else I can do to help. After Jennifer departed, I immediately called Harriet to update her on both conversations. Her response was characteristically direct. Caroline has overplayed her hand. The conservatorship attempt is legally dubious given your obvious competence, and her Homeowners Association manipulation would collapse instantly if your ownership were revealed. But revealing my ownership is a nuclear option, I reminded her. It would destroy any chance of reconciliation with Caroline. Is reconciliation still your goal? Harriet challenged gently. Or is protecting your grandchildren and your assets from her controlling behavior more important now? It was a fair question. My initial objective had been to maintain my relationship with my grandchildren while preserving family harmony. But Caroline's conservatorship plan changed the equation significantly. She wasn't just being overprotective, she was actively plotting to seize control of my finances under false pretenses. I need to think strategically, I said finally. Thursday's meeting is the immediate concern. If I can defeat the senior living policy without revealing my ownership, that creates breathing room to address the conservatorship threat separately. And if you can't, Harriet pressed, then I'll need to be prepared to use every advantage at my disposal, I acknowledged, including ownership disclosure if necessary. That evening I spent hours reviewing the documents Jennifer had provided, cross-referencing them with the property records for Fairfield Estates and the original community charter my grandfather had established. The governing documents contained several provisions that Caroline and her allies appeared unaware of. Provisions that could be pivotal in Thursday's confrontation. My phone rang just after 9. Trrr. It was Richard, his voice tense and hushed. "Margaret, I can't talk long. Caroline just left for an emergency board meeting at Diane Abernathy's house. Something's happened that's accelerated their timeline." My grip tightened on the phone. "What prompted this?" Richard Chen called her, apparently quite agitated. I only heard Caroline's side, but it sounded like he raised objections to the senior living policy, and she's trying to shore up support before Thursday. He paused. "She mentioned your name several times, said something about needing to neutralize the situation before you could cause problems." "Is she still pursuing the conservatorship?" I asked directly. "I searched her office after our meeting," Richard confirmed. "The documents are gone. She must have digital copies or they're stored elsewhere. But I found a calendar entry for next Monday with a Dr. Harris. The note says Competency Evaluation Strategy." This was moving faster than I'd anticipated. Monday is the day before the homeowners meeting. She's trying to undermine my credibility. "Exactly. And Margaret," his voice dropped even lower. "Alexandra overheard part of Caroline's phone conversation. She came to me afterward, very upset, asking why Mom was saying mean things about Grandma. The children are beginning to notice the situation." My heart ached for my grandchildren, caught in this painful dynamic. "Thank you for telling me, Richard. Keep the children as insulated as possible. I'll handle the rest." After we hung up, I sat in my darkened living room watching the lights of houses in the subdivision below. In one of those homes, my daughter was actively plotting against me, gathering allies to cut me off from my grandchildren and seize control of my assets. The betrayal cut deeply, but beneath the pain, a cold resolve was forming. I had spent my life building security, financial, emotional, communal. I had inherited Fairfield Estates as a legacy and expanded it into a thriving community where families like mine could flourish in a supportive environment. I would not allow that vision to be corrupted, nor would I permit myself to be cast aside by the daughter I had always supported. The time for gentle persuasion had passed. Caroline had escalated this conflict, and now I needed to respond with appropriate force, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity to protect myself, my grandchildren, and the community I had helped build. I picked up my phone and dialed Richard Chen's number. As a board member who knew my ownership status, he would be a crucial ally in the coming confrontation. "Mrs. Fairfield," he answered immediately, his tone apologetic. "I was about to call you. Things have taken an unfortunate turn." "I'm aware," I said calmly. "I understand there's an emergency board meeting happening now." "Yes. Caroline is attempting to fast-track the senior living policy for approval before Thursday's public meeting. She's framing it as a safety emergency that can't wait for community input." He sounded troubled. "I objected on procedural grounds, which is why I'm not at the meeting. My absence prevents them from having the quorum needed for official action." A strategic move on his part. "Thank you for that, Richard. But this situation requires more than procedural delays. I think it's time to be more direct about certain realities." "You mean revealing your ownership?" He sounded uncertain. "That's a significant step, Mrs. Fairfield." "Perhaps. But sometimes the most powerful move in chess is the one your opponent never saw coming." I outlined my preliminary plan for Thursday's meeting. "Can I count on your support?" After a moment's consideration, he agreed. "Yes, the community charter is quite clear about the original vision for Fairfield Estates. What Caroline and her allies are proposing contradicts both the letter and spirit of those founding principles." We spoke for another 20 minutes, refining our approach for Thursday. By the time we concluded the call, I had the beginning of a strategy that would allow me to counter Caroline's moves without immediately revealing my ownership, though I would be prepared to do so if necessary. Next, I called James Foster, the Homeowners Association president, ostensibly to inquire about attending Thursday's meeting as a concerned community member. Our conversation was revealing. "Of course you're welcome to attend, Margaret," he assured me. "Though I should mention there's been some discussion about the senior living policy proposal." "What kind of discussion?" I prompted. He hesitated. "Some board members feel it's necessary for safety reasons. Others, myself included, question whether it's an appropriate restriction on property owners' rights to have elderly family members living independently." "And where does the board currently stand?" I asked innocently. "Divided," he admitted. "But Caroline has been very persistent. She's framing it as protection for vulnerable seniors." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I understand there may be some personal considerations in this case." So Caroline had already begun spreading her narrative about me being a safety concern. "I see," I said neutrally. "Well, I look forward to sharing my perspective as a longtime community member on Thursday." After ending the call, I made one final decision. It was time to speak directly with the person at the center of this conflict, my daughter. I sent Caroline a simple text message. "I know about the conservatorship plan and the emergency board meeting tonight. We need to talk before Thursday. Your choice of time and place. Mom." Her response came nearly an hour later, past midnight. "My office at the foundation, 9 a.m. tomorrow. Come alone." The directness of her message confirmed what I already suspected. Caroline was no longer pretending. The conflict between us had moved into the open, and tomorrow would be our first direct confrontation. I checked my email one last time and found a message from Harriet with a subject line that made my breath catch. Competency evaluation documentation. She had obtained copies of the forms Caroline had prepared for Dr. Harris, including a detailed narrative of my supposedly concerning behaviors. According to Caroline's account, I was exhibiting paranoid tendencies, excessive fixation on the grandchildren, reckless financial decisions, and inappropriate interference in family boundaries. She had carefully constructed a case designed to raise red flags with any evaluating physician, particularly one who was only hearing her version of events. The calculated nature of her approach left me both heartbroken and coldly furious. This was my daughter, whom I had raised alone after Edward's death, whom I had supported through college and early marriage, whose family I had helped establish in a beautiful home in a community my family had built. The Fairfield County Arts Foundation occupied a renovated Georgian mansion in the cultural district. In the early morning light, the building's grand facade seemed almost theatrical, an appropriate setting for the confrontation ahead. I arrived 15 minutes early, deliberately choosing to wait in my car across the street, observing the entrance. At precisely 8:45, Caroline pulled up in her silver Mercedes, dressed in an impeccable burgundy suit that projected authority and control. I gave her 5 minutes to settle into her office before crossing the street. The foundation hadn't officially opened for the day, and the reception area was empty. A sign on the desk indicated the receptionist would return at 9 a.m. I knew the way to Caroline's office. I had visited several times in the early days of her appointment to the board, before our relationship had deteriorated to its current state. The door to her corner office was slightly ajar. I knocked once and entered without waiting for a response, a small assertion of my own authority in what I knew would be a power-laden interaction. Caroline was seated behind her desk, a sleek glass and steel construction that matched the contemporary art on the walls, all carefully curated to project sophisticated taste. She looked up from her computer screen, her expression composed but cold. "Mother," she acknowledged, not rising to greet me. "Please close the door." I did so, then took a seat across from her without being invited. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Caroline leaned back slightly, her posture deliberately relaxed though her eyes remained vigilant. "Your message was concerning. Accusations about conservatorship plans, emergency meetings. You sound paranoid. The word choice wasn't accidental. Paranoia was prominently featured in the competency evaluation documentation she had prepared. Not accusations, Caroline. Facts. I placed a folder on her desk and opened it to reveal copies of her emails with the elder law attorney. These were anonymously delivered to Harriet. Quite detailed plans you've been making about my supposed mental decline. Her expression flickered briefly. Surprise, then anger, quickly controlled. She glanced at the documents, then back at me. Going through my private communications, that only confirms my concerns about your behavior. Her voice was calm, professional, the tone she likely used when dealing with difficult board members. Mother, I've been consulting experts because I'm genuinely worried about your judgment lately. The fixation on the children, the undermining of our parental authority, the financially irresponsible gifts. Financially irresponsible? I repeated, with a raised eyebrow. Sapphire pendants and educational books hardly qualify as extravagance. Caroline's eyes narrowed slightly. So, you admit circumventing our explicit boundaries regarding gifts, after I specifically told you, after you threatened to cut me off from my grandchildren entirely if I didn't comply with your arbitrary rules, I interrupted, keeping my voice steady. Yes, I gave them small, meaningful gifts. That's hardly evidence of mental decline. It's evidence of boundary violations, she countered. And it's not just the gifts. It's your increasing interference in our family decisions, your emotional manipulation of the children, your refusal to acknowledge that Richard and I are the parents, not you. I studied my daughter's face, the determined set of her jaw, the defensive posture, the carefully constructed narrative she had created to justify her actions. In that moment, I saw with painful clarity how Caroline had reframed our entire relationship to support her current agenda. My support had become interference. My love for my grandchildren had become manipulation. My financial acumen had become a threat to her authority. Caroline, I said quietly, why are you really doing this? Is this truly about the children's welfare, or is it about something else? She stiffened almost imperceptibly. What are you implying? I'm asking directly, I corrected. Is this about protecting the children from some imagined harm I might cause, or is it about controlling access to resources, both emotional and financial? That's absurd, she dismissed, but a slight flush had risen to her cheeks. We're establishing healthy family boundaries and ensuring you receive appropriate care as you age. Appropriate care, I repeated. Such as having my financial autonomy stripped away through a manufactured competency evaluation scheduled for Monday, I believe, with Dr. Harris. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.